So, Dustin, let's kick things off here. First topic being the New York Times and them taking a look at sports betting and writing a piece in which, hey, look, maybe we don't agree with all of the things that were written there on the New York Times. That being said, it is something for us to maybe, at least bring to light here, and it is a good discussion topic.
Yeah. And you said there are only two topics might be tidy. I don't know. We could talk about this one for a while, in addition to the other one. We could talk for a while on all these things. But yeah, New York Times did a series of pieces. The main bar, let's say, had a pretty cringy headline. And also they made a big deal of saying they spent a year doing this. And the reporting on this ranges from good to I didn't learn anything, all within the same thing. There wasn't a whole lot like super new. It did aggregate a lot for the masses, I think, that you maybe not know this huge lobbying effort that went into sports betting that I'd say that regulators, how dedicated are they to regulating sports betting? I don't know, not that much maybe across but I think when I heard the New York Times, they had this large series of pieces coming and they said they spent a year on it. I kind of expected more out of it. It did feel like they parachuted into the sports betting industry and maybe only did surface level. Like we're a big believer in journalism, New York Times, but I'm not sure they did this justice. And this also comes to the backstory of first, when I started doing this back in 2015, man, they did an amazing job covering kind of the offshore business and daily fantasy and everything going on. It was an amazing bunch of reporting that they did back then. And I'd say this was not quite as good as that. Still interesting, still lots to unpack, but I don't know. I expected to learn a lot and I'm not sure I did. And I'm curious what Adam's thoughts are on after he read all of it too.
Yeah. Adam, I kind of got the same as Dustin. I mean, I don't know. I didn't really, and maybe we're super, we are, we're certainly super inside the bubble here. And we know, probably more than most people do about the industry and the comings and goings and stuff. But, again, if someone takes a deep dive into anything, I feel like I should be able to pull something that I didn't really know, or that there would be some sort of nugget that I come away with. And I didn't really.
So just for the people who don't follow this as closely as we do and aren't in the journalism world the way that we are, when we talk about a parachute job, it's a derogatory term within the journalism industry for someone who doesn't regularly cover the space and just sort of shows up out of nowhere and tries to make sense of a subject that those who've been following that subject for a long time have a much greater understanding of. And I think parachute job applies pretty well to what happened here with this New York Times series. Look through the set of articles and take the first one about the lobbying effort and saying, cigars and alcohol went into lobbying legislators over the course of years to legalize sports betting. Okay, so I'm going to come at this from both someone who covers the industry and someone who worked in politics. Is there anything new to the idea of an industry or a vice industry in the perception of some lobbying state regulators, legislators, etc., to legalize their industry? No, there's nothing unique about that. Now, to the average person who might not know anything about it and might just be seeing all of these ads on TV and saying, but I don't understand. There was none of this 5 years ago. And where did it come from? Yes, there's value in understanding that it took a major push at the legislative level in many different jurisdictions to make it happen. Okay, so then I move on to another piece and I see the part about they have a sports betting deal at LSU. Yes, we covered it. Frankly, we got a fair amount of blowback about our coverage of it. And I'll talk as someone who spent a lot of time covering UNLV. It's not new. Like, William Hill has had a deal with UNLV for many, many, many years. This is not a new thing. It's a new thing nationwide, and it might be a new thing in front of people's eyes if you have it at multiple universities, University of Colorado, etc. So that I understand. But here's where they lost me when it comes to the New York Times piece. And overall, to what Dustin said, I'm glad that there's serious journalism being done around the space, whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, whether it's us, whether it's our competitors. I'm glad that people are taking what is overall a measured and serious approach to covering the industry, because there are plenty of people who aren't. And when you look at what they talked about in their overview piece of all of these articles, they had a part in there that said, the industry lobbied everybody on the idea that if you didn't make tax rates low enough, that you would send people to offshore operators. And that right there, to me, shows the fundamental misunderstanding in all of this piece, because you're misrepresenting the argument. And when you misrepresent an argument, that's where you lose me. And that argument fundamentally loses the idea that it was already onshore. This isn't about a stick. This is about a carrot. This is about trying to bring people into the regulated market. And that's the part that I think they got wrong fundamentally when they talked about how all this went down.
Yeah, Dustin, it didn't seem like there was enough kind of giving the full like Adam just mentioned, like if you don't really play in the sandbox like we do, and you kind of get the stuff that was unsaid, like we already kind of get the stuff that's unsaid, so we're kind of like, you probably should have mentioned that, but whatever. I think it's easy for us to kind of get like right past that, as to where someone who doesn't know exactly the other side of everything, or how things exactly work, then you come away with something like, a couple of different pieces in a couple of these different articles, where you come away with a skewed idea of how things work, or a skewed idea of how things happen. And then that's where the fundamental kind of breakdown begins.
Yeah. And again, you spent, in subheads in recapping it, they make a big deal of, they spent a year doing this. And again, lots of serious reporting went into this, but how do you do a year reporting, do all these stories, and like kind of basically gloss over the offshore market, which again, regulated markets are competing against and has existed in the United States for more. And again, the New York Times did an amazing job. I can't sell this short. That 2015 series, I guess, was more just a really long enterprise piece on offshore, really captured what was going on there. And that's still there, and that's still part of the market. And to just talk about the regulated market and like forget that even exists is kind of wild to me. And even and again, just illegal bookies, like just bookmakers on the streets, those are still out there too. Like, how do you not cover any of that? And if you're really saying we're doing a deep dive on sports betting, and you just put out the regulated part, and you just ignore all this rest, which really informs the regulated part of it as well, and what's trying to happen, and building this with that. Again, this sports betting is not new in the United States, not even just as a regulated thing. It is not new. It has this huge backstory, and to just skip that and gloss over it, I know is very focused on the regulated market, but I don't know. It feels like there's this stuff missing in there if you're trying to tell the whole story.
And Adam, look, we're obviously, legalized sports gambling advocates, because again, we know the stuff that can come with kind of getting involved with all the other things. I mean, of course, aside from your local bookie down the street, if you get too far in debt, we actually never really even talked about any of that stuff here on this podcast, which, I think is maybe, again, we just kind of assume people know all that stuff. And we talk more about the offshore market and all that, because it does have such an incredible influence and stuff over the industry in general. But I mean, they're, as Dustin just mentioned, like, they're still like the bookie on the corner and stuff. Like, they're still the dude that like, hey, you don't pay me, I'm going to show up at your front door type stuff. I mean, that still exists as well. We're not saying that the legalized sports betting market is perfect. It's certainly not. And that's not what we're getting at with all of this. And should things, when things are bad, be pointed out and all that? Of course. And we try to do that as well here on the podcast, and of course over on the site. But again, it's like I'm not going to say it was an attack or anything like that. It certainly wasn't, but like to kind of ignore all of that other stuff, to me, is, I'm not going to say shoddy reporting, but certainly like suspect at best to me.
So I'm not going to push back on the idea that either of you are putting out there about what the depth was, or what the clarity was, or this or that, because ultimately, yes, we cover the regulated industry. We talk about what are the clear distinctions between the regulated industry and the unregulated industry, whether it's offshore or whether it's bookies. No series from a national outlet like the New York Times is going to be able to capture all of the nuance, right? Mm-hmm. But where you lose me is where you get it wrong, when you straight get something wrong. And in that, to me, if you take a year on something and you fundamentally misunderstand what the difference is between saying we need to entice people into the regulated market versus you are going to now drive them from what I don't know into the black market, that to me is where you lose me ultimately. Now, there are good parts of this, obviously. Like, there was serious journalism done around the idea of promo deductions are costing states tens of millions of dollars in revenue that was promised. And you know what? that needs to be talked about. That needs to be discussed, that the industry was able to successfully lobby for breaks that are allowing them to keep millions of dollars that probably should be going into tax coffers. And obviously there needed to be some serious journalism done. And I'll raise my hand as someone who wrote about this years ago. How is Penn letting Dave Portnoy be the face of their operation? Words like misogynist and racist are ones that I wrote at LSR probably 3 or 4 years ago at this point about Portnoy. Not that that makes me unique in any way. So when we talk about the New York Times, when we talk about this regulation piece, ultimately, all we're saying here is take it all with a grain of salt. There was good journalism done. It just needed to be a little bit more, I would say, layered, maybe a bit more researched, and maybe a bit more thoroughly explained.
Yeah, and I guess more than anything too is anyone who's listening to this who maybe isn't inside the bubble as heavily as we are, if you are working on things for the future, if you have ideas about story in the future or something like that, hey, by the way, Dustin and Adam are really great resources if you need someone to reach out to make sure that all angles are getting covered and different things like that. Because again, I mean, we're all fans of good journalism. Like, we're all fans of people outside of just us in the niche industry covering, this industry, covering, good things, bad things, whatever it might be, and everything in between. There are resources out there to make sure that you're covering all of your bases. And yes, I'm going to beat the drum for us and things like that. But I mean, hey, it's an email away, right? It's a DM on the Twitter machine away, and it can kind of at least plug some of the gaps and some of the holes that I think from future content.
And Matt, just to add to that point, I won't name the outlet or the reporter, but I had a national outlet who has covered this space before have a new reporter who's coming in to cover it, who reached out to me this past week. And all he wanted was a background call. And we talked for 20 minutes on background about here's the industry. And I know Dustin's done it plenty of times as well. And yeah, we're not the only source for it. Right. Talk to anybody about it. But at the same time, there are people doing it the way that we're talking about.
Dustin Gouker. That's that dates back to your piece from 3 years ago as well. So yes, who's this Dustin Gouker guy that's talking here?
Either you do the accent or you don't do it at all, Matthew.
I only have one accent, right? I mean, I only have one.
That's true.
And that's after a few cocktails.